Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The beginning of an unlikely journey. The precinct buzzed with its usual morning rhythm, ringing phones, the clatter of keyboards, and the steady hum of voices blending into a familiar symphony. Maya Anderson leaned back in her chair, her sharp, seasoned eyes scanning the scene she had called home for over 2 decades. The morning sunlight caught the silver streaks in her jet-black curls, a reminder of the years she had spent breaking barriers and earning respect in an institution that wasn't always kind to women like her. Today, though, the precinct felt different. It wasn't the first time she'd had to prove herself, but this time, she wasn't fighting for her own place. She was preparing to hand over her legacy, a legacy forged through grit, resilience, and countless sacrifices. Her promotion to captain marked a pinnacle in her career, but it also meant stepping away from the day-to-day grind that had defined her life for so long. She glanced at the clock. 8:15 a.m. The young officer meant to take over her desk was late. Daryl Thompson, she thought, recalling his name from the transfer papers. Fresh out of the academy, top of his class, and eager to make an impression, or so the report said. Maya wasn't one to judge anyone prematurely, but experience had taught her to measure people not by their resumes, but by how they handled the unexpected. Across the precinct, Officer John Perkins, known to everyone as Gurney, sauntered over, his coffee cup in hand. The lanky veteran officer had been Maya's closest ally over the years, a dependable friend in an environment that hadn't always been welcoming. "Not in uniform today?" Gurney teased, nodding at Maya's casual navy blouse and slacks. Maya smirked, the corners of her lips tugging upward. "Might as well get used to it, John. Captain's uniforms don't involve much street patrol." "Captain Anderson," he said, testing the title. "Sounds good. But you sure you're ready to leave all this behind?" She let her gaze wander over the precinct one more time. "I'll miss it. But it's time. This place needs fresh energy. Someone who sees the world differently." Gurney raised an eyebrow, sipping his coffee. "And you think this Thompson kid's got what it takes?" "That's what I'm here to find out," Maya replied. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Daryl Thompson stared at himself in the mirror, adjusting his freshly pressed uniform. His chest swelled with pride as he pinned on his badge, its shine a stark contrast to the unease bubbling beneath his polished exterior. Today marked the start of his dream, a career in law enforcement, following in the footsteps of his late father. Daryl had idolized his father, a respected officer who had always upheld the law with dignity and grace. But alongside that legacy came a shadow. The unspoken prejudices his father had passed down through casual remarks and veiled lessons. Daryl had worked hard to earn his place at the academy, but deep down, he carried biases he barely acknowledged. The neighborhood he'd been assigned to, known for its diverse population and social challenges, made him uneasy. He didn't voice his concerns, but they lingered, shaping his perceptions in ways he didn't yet understand. "Time to make a difference," he muttered to himself, forcing confidence into his voice. The precinct loomed large as Daryl arrived, its brick facade weathered yet sturdy, a symbol of authority and order. He walked through the glass doors, his polished boots clicking against the floor. The first person he noticed was an older black woman standing near the front desk. She wore casual clothing, a flowing navy blouse and slacks, and chatted easily with a group of officers. Daryl's eyes narrowed slightly as his stomach tightened. Another complainer, he thought, his hand brushing against the edge of his holster. His father's voice echoed in his mind, "Some people are just looking for trouble. Keep your guard up." He approached the desk sergeant, setting his paperwork down with a crisp salute. "Officer Daryl Thompson, reporting for duty." The sergeant barely looked up. "You're late, Thompson. Captain Williams is waiting for you in her office." "Captain Williams?" Daryl repeated, his brow furrowing. The sergeant gestured toward the woman Daryl had been silently judging. She had just stepped away from the desk, moving with an air of authority that seemed out of place in her casual attire. Daryl's confusion deepened. "That's her?" he asked, incredulous. The sergeant gave him a sharp look. "Watch your tone, Thompson. She's your superior." Darryl swallowed hard, his face heating with embarrassment. He watched as the woman, Captain Maya Anderson, disappeared into the office he had assumed would be his. Inside the office, Maya glanced at the clock again. 8:25 a.m. She was just beginning to review some paperwork when the door flew open. Darryl stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "What do you think you're doing in here?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusing. Maya looked up, her expression calm but curious. "Excuse me?" "This is my office," Darryl continued, his words tumbling out before he could think them through. "You have no right to be in here." Maya rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She stood a full head shorter than Darryl, but the authority in her posture made him falter. "And you must be Officer Thompson," she said, her tone even. Darryl's anger boiled over. He didn't register her words, didn't process the calm in her demeanor. All he saw was someone he assumed didn't belong. Without thinking, he lashed out, his hand striking her across the face. The slap echoed in the room like a gunshot. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't stagger. Instead, she turned her head slowly to face him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burning with a quiet fury. "Officer Thompson," she said, her voice low and steady, "you just made the biggest mistake of your career." Darryl's hand trembled as he realized what he had done. The weight of his actions hit him like a tidal wave, drowning the anger that had driven him moments before. He stammered, stepping back, his face pale. Maya raised a hand, silencing him. "Not one more word," she commanded. She walked to her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out her badge, holding it up for him to see. The gold emblem gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the window. "I am Captain Maya Anderson," she said. "Your superior officer. And as of this moment, your future in this precinct is hanging by a thread." Darryl's heart pounded in his chest. His dreams, his ambitions, his identity, all of it felt like it was crumbling beneath him. Maya sat back down, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "Now," she said, her voice firm but calm, "let's talk about what happens next." Reality hits hard. Darryl Thompson sat in his tiny apartment, staring blankly at the transfer papers on his kitchen table. His reflection in the window mirrored the deep frustration etched on his face. The silence of the room was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of his refrigerator. He'd spent the last 3 hours replaying the disastrous morning in his mind. His first day had been a catastrophe, and instead of starting his career with promise, he had slammed headfirst into a wall of shame. Assaulting a superior officer, what kind of fool was he? Worse still, his prejudices had surfaced in a way he couldn't ignore anymore. Maya Williams had given him a lifeline, and yet, it felt like a noose tied to his pride. The transfer to Lincoln Heights wasn't just a job change, it was a reckoning. The precinct was infamous, known for its high crime rates and the deep mistrust between the police and the local community. It was the kind of assignment most rookies dreaded, and Darryl knew why. Officers who went there either learned humility or failed spectacularly. Still, he wasn't ready to give up on his dream. His father, a decorated officer, had instilled in him the values of discipline and justice. Darryl had wanted nothing more than to follow in his father's footsteps, but his actions today had proven he had a long way to go to earn that legacy. Day 1 in Lincoln Heights. The next morning, Darryl arrived at Lincoln Heights precinct promptly at 7:30 a.m. The building was old, its brick exterior marred by graffiti, with faded signs warning against loitering. Inside, the atmosphere was markedly different from the precinct he'd left behind. The walls were plastered with community notices, flyers for youth programs, and photos of officers with local kids. The desk sergeant, a grizzled man with a kind but no-nonsense demeanor, greeted him with a curt nod. "Officer Thompson, you're here to see Captain Martinez, right?" "Yes, sir," Darryl replied, adjusting his collar nervously. The sergeant gave him a once-over, his expression unreadable. "She's in her office." "Good luck." The comment wasn't comforting, but Darryl squared his shoulders and walked toward the captain's office. He knocked twice and entered when a voice called out, "Come in." Captain Angela Martinez was a petite woman in her early 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through Darryl's facade. Her office was a mix of military precision and personal warmth, with neatly arranged files and framed photos of her family and precinct events. "Officer Thompson," she began, her tone neutral but firm. "Take a seat." Darryl complied, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. "I've read your file," Martinez continued, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "Maya Williams sent you here. She spoke highly of your potential, but also mentioned your mishap." Darryl's face burned. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Martinez cut him off. "Save it. You're here to prove you deserve this badge. Lincoln Heights isn't for the faint of heart, officer. The people here don't trust us, and with good reason. If you're not ready to put your biases aside and truly serve this community, you won't last long." "I understand, ma'am," Darryl said, his voice steady despite his internal turmoil. "We'll see," Martinez replied, leaning back in her chair. "Your partner for today is Officer Marcus Reed. He'll introduce you to the neighborhood and show you how we do things here. Pay attention and learn." The first patrol. Officer Reed was a towering figure with a booming laugh and an easygoing demeanor. He greeted Darryl with a firm handshake. "Welcome to the Heights, rookie. Ready for the grand tour?" Darryl nodded, trying to match Reed's energy. "Yes, sir." "Drop the sir," Reed said, chuckling. "We're partners. Let's keep it simple." Their first call of the day came quickly, a noise complaint at a local apartment complex. The building was a crumbling structure, with peeling paint and a faint odor of mildew. As they approached the unit, Darryl could feel eyes on them from the cracked windows above. Inside the apartment, they found a young woman, clearly overwhelmed, trying to calm her two screaming toddlers. Boxes were stacked in the corner, evidence of an impending move. "I'm so sorry, officers," she stammered, clutching a crying child to her chest. "We're leaving today, but my kids are they're having a rough morning." Reed handled the situation with grace, kneeling to speak to the toddlers in a calm, reassuring voice. Within minutes, the children had quieted down, and the woman was thanking them profusely. As they walked back to the patrol car, Darryl couldn't help but feel out of place. "You handled that well," he said, breaking the silence. Reed shrugged. "It's not just about enforcing the law, man. People here need to know we're human too. Sometimes, all they need is someone to listen." A tough encounter. Their second call of the day was more intense, a reported robbery at a local convenience store. When they arrived, the scene was chaotic. The store owner, a middle-aged man of South Asian descent, was shouting at a young black teen who was holding a bag of chips and a bottle of soda. "I told him I'd pay him back tomorrow," the teen yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "You think I'm running a charity?" the owner snapped back. "Pay or leave." Darryl instinctively reached for his holster, but Reed placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Wait," Reed said, stepping forward. "Let's all take a breath," Reed said, his voice calm but authoritative. "What's going on here?" The teen explained that his mother had lost her job, and they were struggling to make ends meet. He hadn't meant to steal, he'd just hoped the owner would trust him until his mother's paycheck came in. Reed turned to the store owner. "How much does he owe you?" $2.50, the man replied, still fuming. Reed pulled out his wallet and handed the owner a $5 bill. "Keep the change," he said, then turned to the teen. "You can't do this again. Understand?" The teen nodded, his eyes wide with relief. "Yes, sir. Thank you." As they drove away, Darryl couldn't hold back his questions. "Why did you pay for him?" "He broke the law." Reed glanced at him. "And what would arresting him accomplish? His family's struggling enough as it is." Sometimes, you've got to look past the surface and see the bigger picture. Lessons begin. By the end of the day, Daryl was exhausted, not from physical exertion but from the emotional weight of everything he'd seen. Reed had shown him a side of policing he hadn't considered, a focus on empathy and understanding, not just rules and authority. As they returned to the precinct, Reed clapped him on the back. "Not bad for your first day. You've got a lot to learn, but you'll get there." Daryl managed a small smile. "Thanks, Reed. I appreciate it." Back in his apartment that night, Daryl sat in silence, reflecting on the day. He realized he had a long road ahead, not just in earning the trust of the community, but in confronting his own biases and learning to be the officer he'd always aspired to be. He didn't know what the next year in Lincoln Heights would bring, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could rise above his mistakes. The turning point. The days in Lincoln Heights turned into weeks, and each shift brought new challenges for Daryl. While Officer Reed continued to guide him with his seasoned wisdom and compassionate approach, Daryl found himself struggling to unlearn old habits and adopt the principles his partner lived by. The reality of Lincoln Heights, the poverty, the systemic inequities, the mistrust of law enforcement, forced him to confront the stark contrast between his ideals and the world he was now a part of. A test of patience. It was a blistering summer afternoon when a call came in about a domestic disturbance in a rundown duplex on the east side of the precinct. The address was familiar to Reed, who muttered, "That's the Jeffersons. This one's going to need kid gloves." When they arrived, the scene was tense. A man in his late 30s, shirtless and heavily tattooed, was pacing the front yard, shouting at the top of his lungs. His wife, visibly shaken, stood near the door clutching a baby, her other children peeking out nervously from behind her skirt. Daryl's instincts flared. His hand hovered near his holster as he prepared for what he assumed would be a violent altercation. "Stay calm," Reed said quietly, stepping in front of Daryl. "Follow my lead." Reed approached the man with a casual demeanor, his hands nowhere near his weapon. "Hey, Mr. Jefferson. What's going on today?" The man turned, his anger palpable. "What's going on? What's going on is that I just lost my job, and now my wife won't stop nagging me about bills. I've had it." Reed nodded sympathetically. "That's rough, man. I can't imagine how stressful that must be. Let's take a walk and cool off a bit. You don't want your kids seeing you like this, right?" The man hesitated, his fury faltering in the face of Reed's calm. Slowly, he nodded and allowed Reed to lead him away from the house. Daryl stayed behind, watching in awe as his partner de-escalated the situation with nothing more than empathy and a steady presence. As Reed and the man talked, Daryl noticed the wife struggling to juggle the baby and her restless children. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Do you need help with anything, ma'am?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She eyed him warily but nodded. "If you could just keep an eye on the kids for a minute." Daryl crouched down to the children's level, introducing himself and engaging them in small talk. They warmed up to him slowly, their initial fear replaced by shy smiles. When Reed returned with Mr. Jefferson, the tension in the air had lifted. The man apologized to his wife, and Reed made arrangements for a social worker to visit the family later that week. As they drove away, Daryl couldn't help but ask, "How did you know that would work?" Reed shrugged. "It doesn't always. But most people just want to be heard. You can't solve every problem with force. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is listen." A critical incident. The true test of Daryl's resolve came 2 months later during a night shift. He and Reed were patrolling near the outskirts of Lincoln Heights when a frantic call came over the radio, shots fired at a local park. They arrived to find chaos. A crowd had gathered, and a teenage boy lay bleeding on the ground, clutching his abdomen. Several bystanders were shouting at each other, and the air was thick with panic. "Over here," a woman screamed, waving them toward the injured teen. Daryl's pulse raced as he crouched beside the boy, applying pressure to the wound. "Stay with me," he said, his voice firm but trembling. "Help is on the way." Reed was already working to control the crowd, his voice cutting through the noise like a beacon. "Back up. Give him space. We need EMTs here now." The teen's eyes flickered open, and he grabbed Daryl's arm weakly. "I didn't do anything," he whispered. "It wasn't me." "I know," Daryl replied instinctively, though he had no idea what had happened. "Just hold on." When the ambulance finally arrived, Daryl helped load the boy onto the stretcher. The crowd was still restless, with accusations flying about who had fired the shots. Reed pulled Daryl aside. "Let's start talking to people. We need to figure out what went down." One witness, an elderly man who had been walking his dog, claimed he'd seen a car speed away moments after the shots were fired. Another bystander, a teenage girl, tearfully admitted she thought she recognized the shooter, a gang member known to frequent the park. As the investigation unfolded, Daryl found himself increasingly involved, piecing together clues and speaking with the victim's family. The boy survived, and his story painted a tragic picture. He had been mistaken for a rival gang member simply because of the color of his hoodie. A hard conversation. That incident haunted Daryl for weeks. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy's terrified eyes, the senselessness of the violence, and the deep-rooted problems that had led to the tragedy. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Daryl and Reed sat in their patrol car, parked on a quiet street. The usual banter was absent, replaced by a heavy silence. "Reed," Daryl began hesitantly, "how do you do it? How do you keep showing up when it feels like nothing ever changes?" Reed leaned back in his seat, staring out the windshield. "Because every small win matters," he said after a moment. "That kid we saved? He's alive because we were there. His family doesn't have to bury him. That's not nothing." Daryl nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "What about the system? It feels so broken. Like we're just putting band-aids on bullet wounds." "You're not wrong," Reed admitted. "But change doesn't happen overnight. It starts with people like you and me doing the right thing, one call at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that sparks something bigger. A shift in perspective." The months that followed were transformative for Daryl. He began to see Lincoln Heights not as a war zone but as a community, one filled with resilient people navigating extraordinary challenges. He volunteered at local youth programs, worked with community leaders, and made a conscious effort to bridge the gap between the precinct and the residents. There were still bad days, days when the weight of the job felt unbearable. But there were also moments of triumph: a child reunited with their family, a neighborhood dispute resolved peacefully, a small gesture of kindness met with gratitude. For Daryl, those moments made all the difference. A full circle moment. Nearly a year after his arrival at Lincoln Heights, Daryl stood in front of a classroom full of wide-eyed fifth graders at the local elementary school. He had been invited to speak about his job and the importance of community. As he answered their questions and shared stories, he realized how far he had come. The anger and arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by humility and a genuine desire to serve. He wasn't perfect, and he still had much to learn, but he was proud of the officer, and the person he was becoming. When the talk ended, a little boy approached him shyly. "Officer Thompson," he said, "when I grow up, I want to be a cop just like you." Daryl crouched down, looking the boy in the eye. "Then promise me this," he said with a smile. "Always treat people with respect and kindness. That's what makes a real hero." As the boy nodded earnestly, Daryl felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was making a difference after all. Redemption and ripples of change. A troubling discovery. One crisp autumn morning, a routine patrol led Daryl and Reed to a derelict warehouse on the edge of Lincoln Heights. Neighbors had reported suspicious activity, and the precinct suspected it might be a hub for local gang operations. When they arrived, the scene seemed quiet, too quiet. The air was heavy with anticipation as they entered the building, their footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. Inside, they found what they had feared: a small arsenal of weapons and a stash of illegal substances. Scattered papers hinted at planned turf wars and potential targets. But what unsettled Darryl most was a ledger on a dusty table. As he flipped through its pages, his stomach churned. The names listed weren't just gang members or known criminals, they included prominent community leaders and even law enforcement officers. Bribes, blackmail, and corruption were documented in chilling detail. Reed leaned over his shoulder, his face darkening as he read. This is going to shake the city," he murmured. Darryl felt a surge of anger and betrayal. "This is why people don't trust us," he said through gritted teeth. "How are we supposed to protect this community when some of our own are part of the problem?" Reed placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "We'll handle it. But we need to be careful. If we go public too soon, we could put ourselves, and this investigation, in serious danger." An uphill battle. The discovery marked the beginning of a grueling operation. Darryl and Reed worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and building a case. It was a delicate balancing act. They had to maintain their regular duties while secretly coordinating with internal affairs and trusted allies within the precinct. As the investigation deepened, Darryl's perspective on his role as an officer continued to evolve. He saw firsthand how systemic corruption undermined everything he and Reed were trying to build. The realization was painful, but also motivating. If anything, it strengthened his resolve to be a force for good. There were moments of doubt, nights when the pressure felt insurmountable and the fear of retaliation loomed large. But Reed's unwavering determination and quiet confidence kept Darryl grounded. "Remember why we're doing this," his partner would say. "For the people out there who still believe in us." A betrayal close to home. As the case neared its climax, Darryl faced a devastating blow. One of the names on the ledger belonged to someone he had considered a mentor during his early days on the force, Captain Elijah Moore, a decorated officer with a sterling reputation. The revelation shook Darryl to his core. Captain Moore had been a guiding figure, the kind of officer Darryl had once aspired to emulate. To learn that he was involved in bribery and had ties to the very gangs terrorizing Lincoln Heights felt like a personal betrayal. Reed noticed Darryl's turmoil and offered a rare moment of candid advice. "This job isn't about the uniform or the badge," he said. "It's about what you do with them." Moore made his choices. "Now it's your turn to make yours." Darryl nodded, his jaw set. He knew what had to be done. The reckoning. The day of the operation arrived, a coordinated raid involving multiple precincts and federal agencies. Darryl and Reed were at the center of it, their months of hard work finally culminating in a chance to dismantle a network that had plagued the city for years. The operation was a success. Dozens of arrests were made, and the evidence collected from the warehouse and subsequent investigations exposed the depth of the corruption. Captain Moore was among those taken into custody, his fall from grace making headlines citywide. For Darryl, the victory was bittersweet. While he felt pride in their achievement, he couldn't ignore the lingering sense of loss. The trust he had placed in Moore, and in the institution itself, had been irreparably damaged. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, Lincoln Heights began to change. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, and for the first time in years, residents felt a glimmer of hope. Local leaders stepped forward to rebuild trust, organizing town halls and community police initiatives. Darryl became a familiar face at these events, often speaking about his experiences and the importance of accountability. His honesty and vulnerability resonated with the community, earning him a level of respect he hadn't anticipated. One evening, as he walked through the neighborhood, a group of kids playing basketball called out to him. "Hey, Officer Thompson. Wanna play?" Darryl hesitated, then smiled. "Only if you're ready to lose," he said, joining them on the court. Laughter and cheers filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined the area. A letter of gratitude. Months after the operation, Darryl received a letter from the teenager they had saved during the shooting in the park. Now recovering and attending school again, the boy wrote about how that night had changed his life. He thanked Darryl for not giving up on him and for treating him like a person rather than just another statistic. The letter brought tears to Darryl's eyes. It was a powerful reminder of why he had chosen this path, and why he needed to stay on it. A legacy in the making. As the years passed, Daryl continued to serve in Lincoln Heights, eventually mentoring new recruits, much like Reed had mentored him. He remained deeply involved in community outreach, always striving to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. Reed eventually retired, leaving behind a legacy of integrity and compassion. On his last day, he handed Daryl a small, battered notebook. "My notes," he said with a wink. "Thought you might want to add a few chapters of your own." Daryl accepted it with a smile, understanding the significance of the gesture. He had come full circle, from an officer filled with arrogance and anger to one committed to justice and humanity. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, he knew he was ready to face them. For Lincoln Heights, Daryl Thompson had become more than just a cop. He was a symbol of hope, proof that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. And for Daryl, the journey was far from over, it was only just beginning.